Hey everybody, RPG Guy here, and this is probably going to be my last video on this subject, which I've only done two, but I want to clarify stuff from my first video about the OGL debacle and why you as a gamer may not need to worry as much about it because, there's ways that we can discuss this and explain something that people aren't really talking about because there is a legal element to it that people like Paizo are going to use against Wizards of the Coast and probably win. What might that be is, well, you can't copyright game rules. You can't copyright game mechanics. I will even actually pull out Section 102 right here. Copy Section 102B of the Copyright Act states, in no case does copyright protection for an original work or authorship extend to any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery, regardless of the form in which it is described, explained, illustrated, or embodied in such work. So what does that mean? It means you can't copyright a fucking D20. You can't copyright the concept of how you as a gamer want to use that D20. You can't copyright the procedure you go through for combat. You can't in a battle system. You can't copyright the method of operation. You can't copyright, the procedure, how you go about, doing it. So what does this mean? It means pretty much everything in the player's handbook. Okay, let me rephrase. That everything that would not be true. It means every mechanic that runs Dungeons and Dragons is not copyrightable, and they never did copyright it. You can't do it. Okay. The OGL, to my understanding and the way I read it, and I took it to my copyright lawyer as a musician. I have one of these. I have a guy who specializes in this. And he plays Dungeons and Dragons, I found out too. Strangely enough, he's like, I'm not worried about it. And I'm like, why aren't you? And he goes, well, here's why. And he's straight laid it out. He goes, you can't copyright game rules. You can't copyright mechanics. You can't copyright how those mechanics are used in an existing game system that you may have made yourself, even if they serve the same function. That was important. So you can't those ideas aren't copyrighted. So what is the OGL really for? Well, it's to protect D&D's intellectual property. Well, what is that? The worlds, the history of those worlds, the story building elements, the language, the names of the languages, the names of spells, maybe the names of that are used for characters that they've published, the names of locations, those kinds of things. The monsters, there's monsters like Owlbear, I think, is copywritten. I do know that the Beholder is copywritten. I'm pretty sure the Tarrasque is copywritten as examples, but they can't copyright mummies. They can't copyright vampires. They can't copyright orcs, goblins, imps, demons. Now the named demons, like maybe the what are some of the? I'm trying to think of the one from Stranger Things. They can't copyright. That is copyrightable, but like the idea of making a game or telling a story that has demons in it, yeah, you can create an adventure like that. Now, this goes into question what is considered OGL and what isn't. Is can I write D&D adventures? You can, you just can't call them that. They're not officially branded from Wizards of the Coast. You can't say that it would work with that system. Okay, it would work with those mechanics, but you can't say that it's licensed by or approved by Wizards of the Coast. You can't put anything that is copywritten directly by Wizards of the Coast in there. So there are about maybe a handful of monsters you can't use. A lot of spells you would have to rename. You could debatably reference these books. That is the one thing I didn't double check. Can I say this evil wizard can use cone of magic missile? Reference Dungeons and Dragons, core book, blah 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 for that spell. That I forgot to ask. But I don't see why you couldn't reference it. or say use that information. But will tell you, you cannot cut it directly out of the source material and put it in. And I do think that that's kind of the base concern there. So just as an understanding, it's not, they can't copyright that stuff. And they haven't been to since the 60s. And it actually goes as far back as the late 1800s, but that's a whole history lesson that's not worth. I mean, me just pretty much telling you, like, somebody literally tried to copyright the idea of making a cookbook, and another guy made his own cookbook, and the guy's like, you can't make that. You can't do that. I own the copyright patent on cookbooks. And then the court's like, yeah, you don't have the right to that. Fuck you. And in this particular case, it's the same concept, just at a more intricate level. You can't copyright the game mechanics. You can't copyright those elements. You can only copyright the phrasing in which you explain those rules. Okay, and the manner in which you explain those rules. That's really all you can do. And so for people who are slightly worried about that, it just means that people are going to straight up not bother with OGL licensing. They're going to go to somebody who's offering it for free, which is Paizo. Paizo has gone on record, I believe, and said that they're releasing their 2.0 as an OGL, irrevocable OGL. So just use their monsters, use their system, use those elements, use their interpretation of, certain monsters that are special. Just stop using the Wizards of the Coast stuff, which means there's going to be they're going to sell less monster manuals. They're going to sell less. They're going to sell less books and whoever made this decision at Wizards of the Coast is a complete idiot. That doesn't. I guarantee you, they don't play Dungeons and Dragons, and they don't know anything about modules or building adventures or homebrew. They know nothing about it. They're just like, we should be able to make money off of that. Not even understanding at its core that the game rules are not copyrightable. Some lawyer that's sitting there is like, excuse me, Mr. Mrs. President of Wizards of the Coast, you can't copyright that stuff? Well, why can't we? It's our system. It's like, yeah, but they're game mechanics. Anybody can come up with game mechanics that are exactly identical to what we've done. We'll sue them anyway. It's like, but we're gonna lose. Some people do honestly think that the court system, the legal system here in the U.S. is what they see on TV. It's not. I've been in 2 copyright cases, legislatively, or not, cases in my life, having to sit in a courtroom, which I won both. The point is that they're very boring, they're very droll, and the judge is going to sit there and decide if this is even worth the time or effort. Okay, and when he looks at it and says, all that Paizo's guys have to say is Section 102B of the Copyright Act states this, he'll look at it and go, yeah, hey, Wizards of the Coast, here's my middle finger. Goodbye, have a nice day, fuck you. Now, that doesn't stop Wizards of the Coast from digging through every page of Paizo's publications to find infringement, but they can keep playing that game as much as they want. They're just going to dig themselves a deeper hole, and they will just cease to, as a company, to exist. Because also, like I said, ultimately you can't copyright game mechanics. So I just want that to be understandable first and foremost. You can't copyright Wizards. You can't copyright the concept of Wizards spells and how you go about using a d20 or any set of dice to decide how you do damage. You just cannot write it exactly the same way as they do. And there are some spells that they do technically own the rights to because it's named after a character like Fizben or Drizzt or anything like that. If they named it after a character, you can't call it that. You can still use it. Like the idea of Magic Missile, there are other game systems that have this idea. They just don't call it Magic Missile. It's still, you still roll a crap ton of D4s. It auto hits all its targets. You just don't call it Magic Missile. So there, because again, it's a spell that has a multi-target attack, hit, or it can all hit the same target, and it's, we have weapons in real life that do this. So it's not, and there's been science fiction weapons that do it on an extreme level. I just watched the new first episode of Trigun, the Trigun Stampede, the new one, and it's not very good. But regardless, they'd use it in that show. That would be violation of D&D's magic missile, would it not? No. It's a stupid ploy. It's a stupid idea. And Wizards of the Coast is stupid for trying to push OGL 1.1 or whatever the hell they're trying to do. And I do think that because they haven't released an official statement on this, they're testing the waters to see if people would notice and how much of a shit they would give. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really affect Paizo as much as people think it does, which is why Paizo says, hey, if they're going to try to sue us, well, we're going to go ahead and sue them. Or we'll sue them for violation of our copyright, because if they try to claim any of our stuff as theirs, we will destroy them. And Paizo has every grounds to do that. Wizards of the Coast, I don't know. And now, I'll be fair, I haven't read a Pathfinder book in a long time. But my understanding is if they remove all the SRD stuff, which they said there isn't that much in there, so I don't know what they legitimately borrowed. But if they just remove it all, it's still going to be the same game system without the bullshit. So I just want to reassure some of you that I have a feeling Wizards of the Coast is going to backpedal pretty hard, because now you have a lot of legal analysts. There's a lot of people studying what they're going to try to do. And I think at the end of the day, they realize that the OGL is completely pointless. The only thing that it really does is it means you cannot use their copywritten world characters. And when I say world, I mean the fantasy map, the names of the locations. But the idea of making adventures, the idea of making barbarians, wizards, warlocks, sorcerers, fighters, bards, all of that stuff, Wizards of the Coast cannot copyright that. They can't even copyright the mechanics of how those classes operate. Okay, straight up, just can't do it. They're not going to win that fight. They're not going to win that argument. So many people should know that there is some fallback. The catch is that you can't use their copywritten IPs, the intellectual property, the artwork. You can't cut and paste their grids into your own. You can't cut and paste their stats. You can still use the stats. Okay, keep that in mind. You still can use the stats, but you have to make sure that you do not describe the creatures using the information that's in the book. You'll have to come up with your own descriptions, which can be almost identical. It just cannot be written exactly the same way. So we covered that. Sorry, had a yawn there for a second. So we covered that. What about things like Critical Role? Well, I wondered about that too. I put some thought into it, and I'm like, would they actually prevent things like Critical Role or people showing off their tabletop games? No, they can't. It falls under fair use. You are taking a book and you're taking your friends on an adventure through that book, and your experience of that adventure, as well as their experiences, are fully copyrightable by oneself. If that was the case, you couldn't make Let's Play videos. It would not fall under fair use, even with or without commentary, for that matter. I know they're trying to crack down on playthroughs of people not talking. That's a big thing going on, kind of under the rug legally. But I talk in my Let's Play, so I'm not worried about it. But for the people who don't, that is something they're trying to stop. But the point is that you are having an experience. So, for example, the characters that my friends in my table game have made, Grilth the Naked Goblin, we've got Thunk the Drunk, who was a character, we've got Snuggles the Defiler, and we have, Randall the Fighter. Yeah, it's like everybody else is weird except for Randall. And the Shifty, they are not copyrightable characters. Those belong to the creative intellectual properties of my friends at Jack Tart Studios. They don't belong to Wizards of the Coast. They never did. The way that we experienced the adventure, the things that happened in the adventure that we went on, those things are not copyrightable. That falls under fair use. Wizards of the Coast probably knows this. So I do speculate that Critical Role is being fed a lot of probably misinformation, possibly about, hey, you know, they're trying to make a deal with Critical Role. They're going to try to make deals with the big name people, but the big name people also don't need to check with their own lawyers. Because I don't see how Critical Role would not fall under fair use. If they take a module like Curse of Strahd or Horde of the Dragon Queen or whatever they want to play, you know, they want to pull an adventure out of Tales from Yawning Portal or whatever. If they play it themselves and they record themselves playing this game, that falls under fair use. That there's no difference between a Let's Play video of a video game, of a video game, and a playthrough of a tabletop game. They all fall under fair use because they are transformative works. It is no longer the original work. You cannot have the same exact experience Critical Role is going to have, okay, by just buying a Dungeons and Dragons adventure module. Not even buying their own module. You won't have the same experience. Things won't happen the same way. Your decisions and your creativity will convert what the original product is into its own thing, which is its own marketable idea. This is how fair use has always worked. Critical Role, I'm pretty sure, knows this, which is why they're not saying anything. And number one. And number two, they're not going to say anything until D&D releases something that's actually official. I have a feeling that these are letters being sent back and forth. These releases, these leaks are being sent back and forth, and lawyers are like, yeah, you can't do that. Try again. Oh, yeah, you can't do that. Try again. I can't believe for a minute that they think they're going to get away with certain things that are just like already been. I mean, there have been court cases over Let's Plays already. There have been court cases over copyrightable game whether you can copyright game rules and game mechanics. There's already been court cases that have said you can't copyright those things. You can't make claim to that. So again, just for people who are like stressed out significantly, I want to assure you that there are some things that have not been discussed yet, and there are things that are going to challenge what Wizards of the Coast is claiming they're going to be able to do. Bottom line, just don't throw a beholder in your story. Just make an Ahriman or something. I believe those are not copywritten. It's still a giant floating eye. It's from a different. It's just look up monsters throughout multiple cultures, and start creating them from there. That's pretty much what Gary Gygax and friends did. I mean, at the end of the day, I do think that it's gonna, you know, break down into, oh well, they'll just sue you. Well, they can try. You don't need a lot of lawyering to just look up, you know, your, you know, legislative stuff and your rights. And to be honest with you, some people are like, oh, they have all the money for all the lawyers. They could just sue you into complete silence. Not necessarily. They can't necessarily do that. If you win a copyright case, okay, and you just go through the effort to fight it, and then you want them to pay for damages of your expenses, and many lawyers are actually really good about that. They won't necessarily, there are some that will definitely charge you, but if you have a pretty straightforward case of in percent, let's look at this instance, they will pretty much be like, yeah, we're gonna win this case pretty open shut. This is absurd, and many of them will defer payment until after the lawsuit is over, and then you could charge for damages. And that's one thing Wizards of the Coast does not want to do, is pay damages. I mean, a lot of companies and industries are failing right now. They're struggling right now. And they're trying to make a buck on everything. That they're trying to monetize everything that they can. But there is a thing where companies will overreach. And that's what I think is happening, you know, here. I don't care what their motivation is. I don't care what their rationale is for doing this. They're stupid for doing it because they didn't even read their own OGL laws. They think their OGL is the law. And I don't know if anybody's ever tested it before, but now it's going to get put to the test. And I guarantee you they're going to try to copyright their game mechanics, and they're just going to get a punch right in the testicles for it. And it's going to be hilarious. Just some tiny guy is going to be there, be like, hey, Wizards of the Coast, you can't copyright game mechanics. Bam, right in the nuts. Bam, right in the nuts. So Pathfinder's me giving an alternative. So I do think I covered the two major concerns people are worried about. I don't watch Critical Role. I've I've never watched any full campaign of theirs. I think one time I watched like 15 minutes of it, and it really wasn't that appealing to me. So I don't know much about what they do. I'm assuming they just stream live play of them playing a D&D module and making their own D&D modules. I don't think that they're going to be affected by this. I'm pretty sure they've already consulted their lawyers and their attorneys and all of that. And that's why they haven't made a statement yet, because until Wizards of the Coast makes a statement, they're not going to act either. But I do think that most people doing things are going to be okay. You just don't reference the SRD or the OGL. Don't reference it, and do not use mechanics, or no, you can use the mechanics. Do not name specific places, events, characters, named spells, change the name, and do not mention any world building elements that exist in Wizards of the Coast, monsters that are owned by Wizards of the Coast. You can actually find online resources to help you with that, because this has always been an issue. Okay, straight up, it's always been a problem. So you can protect yourself from Wizards of the Coast if you still want to keep making your own adventures and whatnot. Supplement people, I'm sorry, you just can't supplement D&D anymore. If you have to reference and use examples from D&D, I mean, there's ways to get around it. It would just be very difficult. I don't have an answer for those individuals who want to make supplements and supplemental apps for Dungeons and Dragons. However, I do think that there's some leeway. If your apps are just to assist in the functioning of mechanics, you should be fine. I don't think you're going to get sued. I think you would get sued if you were creating something like a quick reference guide that is a replacement for the monster manual. They're really just making this ridiculous. They're just going to force people to buy at the end of the day, it would force you to buy a monster manual, meaning you can't make a website that has every monster stat on it from the Dungeons and Dragons handbook, or every entry. It means you can't do those types of things anymore. And I think that's maybe what they're concerned about, but they haven't made a statement, so I'm not going to presume anything. And so does it really affect most people? It's hard to say. It is hard to say. But I do want to assure many of you, from what I've learned recently, you can't copyright game mechanics. You can't copyright the function of things. You can't copyright just straight up really any of those things, that the ideas, procedures, processes, systems, methods of operation, concept, principle, or discovery, regardless of the form in which it is described, explained, illustrated, or embodied in such work. So you can't, that's all you need to know. I mean, is there some intricacies in there? Yes, there's intricacies for everything. There's more details that need to be discussed. But as a whole, I don't want people to feel like they can't publish their own adventures that require you to use the Dungeons and Dragons core books. You can say that. You just can't reference certain creatures. You can't reference certain spells. And you still can create the stories you want to create. You just need to make sure not to directly reference the intellectual property of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, and cut and paste it into your own book. Okay, you just can't do that anymore. So, like I said, people have been making, publishing D&D adventures even back in 2nd edition, Advanced D&D, back when TSR was still around. People were publishing adventures. It's just that they weren't directly referencing the original source books. However, they did say, in order to play this module, you will need the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Why? Because because back then you could not take out the information directly from the book and cut and paste it into your own book. And that would be a copyright concern when you think about it, because then you don't need the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual to play your adventure. You don't need... They put out pretty much a free starter handbook player's handbook. So that's, you know, they burnt that bridge just by being stupid. But, you know, there are things that you as a adventure designer or a module designer, you have some leeway. And at the end of the day, if like I said, Pathfinder's releasing their stuff, so you may as well just start looking at their stuff and modulating it to your own, making it work to your own, so you don't even have to deal with D&D. So that's my stance on some of that. You're welcome to look up what copyright law is. Look up just game rules and game mechanics. Can you copyright them? And you'll come up with the same stuff that pretty much anybody else would come up with, and that you can't do it. They can't do it. They cannot do it legally. We have court cases as far back as the 60s, and that even goes as far back as the pre-1900s, where they couldn't copyright that stuff. So I do want to assure you guys that there are some things that probably will have to change that are definitely going to hurt Wizards of the Coast. But at the end of the day, functionally, don't throw away the modules and adventures you wanted to write. Don't get rid of that stuff. Okay, if you really want to be hardcore and really screw D&D over, just go and make it for Paizo. Okay, make it for Pathfinder 2.0. They're not going anywhere. Okay, I'm pretty sure that they're not violating almost any of Wizards of the Coast SRD stuff. And they're going to have their own lawyers comb through the books and make sure to tell them what they got to take out. Or rewrite, which is probably there's my mouse. Or rewrite, which is probably the gist of it. So with that said, I might be able to answer a few questions in the comments below, but in general, if you're not sure about it, always ask a lawyer. If you can't afford a lawyer, double check what you think make sure you look up what game mechanics are owned by Wizards of the Coast, and also know that they cannot own the concept of a D20. They can't they when it comes to the dice and how you use them in a game, they don't own the rights to that. They never did. Okay, if that were the case, you know, Super Mario Brothers would own the rights to Mega Man. The whole concept of a platforming video game is not exclusive to anyone. The concept of an RPG game that uses dice is not ownable by anyone. They don't even own the right to the D20. They did not invent the 20-sided dice. I did actually look into that. I forgot where I found it, but I did find out that the 20-sided dice predates Dungeons & Dragons. It would have to. Because how did Gary Gygax get a hold of one? You know, unless he made it himself. Which is possible, but probably not likely. But the idea of having a 20-sided dice is not copywritten. That's not even a copyright issue. That's a patent. And they do not have a patent on a 20-sided dice, because if they did, only Wizards of the Coast could make 20-sided dice. So, again, I think it's just Wizards of the Coast stroking themselves off a little bit, if that's even what it is. It could be an update where they want to start charging for the source material of the intellectual property, which I'm fine with that. It's like, oh, okay, if people are using beholders in their storylines, then we want a take from that. All right, fine, take a take from it, because the next story I write will not have them in it. I will not, I will make an effort too in any works that I want to do, never to reference the D&D world, because, screw it. Now, again, like I said, it's not saying that you can't do that. It's just saying you've got to pay the guys. But a lot of homebrew that I've experienced personally never took place in Neverwinter, never took place in, Baldur's Gate, or, any of the, major towns, Waterdeep. It's like, okay, I could use that town, and that town is fully accessible to me in the original OGL 1.0, but my whole stance is this: make your own stuff up, guys. The best part is straightforward. That the Dungeon Mastery Guide will tell you how to make your own towns and cities. And it's a little more work, yes, but I think ultimately you'll make a better product. because no one will get that experience anywhere else except from you. Okay, nobody, now it does make it a little, you have to do more work. You can't just make your story take place in Neverwinter, or you can't just make your story take place in Baldur's Gate or any of that kind of stuff. You'd have to make your own world, but it's doable. And a lot of people have done that. I did that with my adventures. My adventures do not take place in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and they never have. And one of these days, maybe I'll get back to writing adventures again. I have several of them written out. I just haven't put them in publisher and done the game test, the play testing, and the mechanic testing and all that. But ultimately, like I said, most people are I don't know if people are overreacting. I do not know to what extent people have borrowed from the OGL. What are they using from the OGL? But my stance is relatively simple. You can't copyright game mechanics, and you can't copyright people playing a game. I can play the board game Monopoly with my friends, record that experience, and the owners of Monopoly do not own the rights to it. They can kiss the hairiest part of my ass and the fattest part of my ass if they tried to. I would go out of my way to get that Monopoly money, baby. Trust me. Try it. Okay? Wizards of the Coast is in the same bag. They cannot go after people because they changed the OGL. The only thing they can go after are the things that I described, the intellectual properties that they actually own the copyrights to. Now, some people might say, well, wait a minute. They own the D20 system. They said that they own it. Well, that's great. No court would ever hold it. So here's the thing that I did learn from my copyright lawyer. Sometimes things get copyrighted that shouldn't be copywritten, and you can challenge it. So just like one of the ones he always teased was the term mutant, right? They said it was exclusive to, Marvel. Marvel owns the copyright to mutant. The funny thing about that is that nobody's ever challenged it, not in any substantial way. Okay. And we know this because Marvel's never gone after anybody for using it, to my knowledge. And my point is that if they did, that means we couldn't have the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Because those are mutant turtles that know ninjutsu. The Toxic Avenger is a mutant. They reference him, I think, in some of the stuff that it was made about Toxic Avenger. He's referred to as he was mutated from toxic waste, and thus he's a mutant. So again, it's one of those things where it's just somebody's going to come along and do it, and then people will be like, Marvel's got all this money, blah, blah. It doesn't go that far. It usually never goes that far. It'll go, if it even goes to court. Number one, there's no jury. Okay, people think there's a jury. Juries, I believe, are only for criminal cases. Copyright is more of a civil case. So it's going to go to a judge, and a judge is going to sit there and go, is the term mutant in the dictionary? Is a mutant an individual who has been augmented by mutation? The arguments are pretty simple. And people have used the term mutant long before it was copywritten by Marvel. So, again, I'm not going to get into the legal jargon of all of this, but yes, Marvel can try to get a copyright. I think they were successful in getting it. I don't know. I believe they were. But the idea is that they don't act on it, and there's a reason they don't act on it, because it would never be upheld in a court of law. So they just wasted whatever it cost them to copyright it. It's a deterrent because people believe, oh, they own the copyright to that idea, we're screwed. It's like, no, some people just own copyrights because they can. And yes, they do use it as a means to shove people aside if somebody starts making money. But if I made a comic book that had people who were hit by radiation and now have superpowers, and I called them and people called them mutants in my story, I wouldn't get in trouble. I really probably wouldn't. I probably would not get in trouble for that. Why? Because because you can't copyright a fundamental idea. Okay? You can't. It's like if Disney wanted to copyright the word fantasy. It's like, no, they can't do that. So I'm trying to give some insight into how copyright law works for people who are wondering and like concerned, and rightfully so. But there are ideas here that people should know. There are things you don't have to worry about. Copyright is a very open kind of idea of things when it comes to talking about, and just because somebody owns a copyright to something doesn't mean that copyright will be honored in a court of law, regardless of if it passed the Copyright Office. All you got to do is just fucking submit it, and if nobody's submitted it yet, you can technically copyright it. But as soon as it's used in court, your copyright can be taken away if it's found to not be fair. So if Wizards of the Coast did copyright their game mechanics and rules, anybody who brings it to a court of law is going to look at it and go, well, you can't copyright that stuff, buddy. So unfortunately, yes, you spent money to copyright that stuff. We're not giving your money back. So Toodles, get fucked. Oh, by the way, you might have to pay legal fees because you did a frivolous lawsuit. Because there is this one weird thing that I'm not familiar about. Something I would like more other lawyers to chime in on is, like, if you get something copyrighted, does that guarantee that it stays copyrighted? Or if it's challenged and your copyright is unfounded, and then the people that you sued sue you back, can you sue the government for falsely copywriting something? I don't think so. I think the government has a fail safe for that, because there's just too many things being copywritten all the time. Things left and right are constantly being copywritten, and I will say that most of us should not worry so much. I think things are going to be fine going forward. I do think we should discuss this more. Definitely, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the comment area below. But I'm just giving you the blunt knowledge that I have. And I'm going to restate it again. You cannot copyright game mechanics. You cannot copyright game mechanic procedures. You cannot copyright the idea of using a D20 for any purpose. Those are not copyrightable ideas. Okay? They do not fall under copyright. Monsters, worlds, the names of spells, the names of places, the names of people, you can copyright that in your fantasy worlds. Even the names of people is very shifty. You have to come up with something pretty original. And if somebody decides to name their fucking kid that, you can't sue them. But that's my point. Copyright is definitely much more fluid and is sometimes clear enough that we can make certain assertions about the future of the new OGL. Hopefully that gives you guys some more insight. I'm your host, the RPG Guy. If you like me talking about these subjects, definitely mention that in the comments below as well. But yeah, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think it's going to be as bad as people think by the end of the day. Just don't use their material. Go to Pathfinder. Go to somewhere else if you need that much, or create it. Better yet, create it yourself. Always create it yourself when in doubt. Anyway, thanks for stopping by, guys, and we'll see you guys next time.